How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
When we look at the devastation that burning fossil fuels is causing all around us, it can be easy to spiral into a dark place, especially when we see a lack of political urgency to address the crisis. But perhaps we just need to look at these pictures through a wider lens. We can then focus on the progress that is being made. Rebecca Solnit has been examining hope and the unpredictability of change for over 20 years. This year, she co-edited an anthology called Not Too Late, which serves as a guidebook for changing the climate narrative from despair to possibility. Rebecca Solnit, today on Climate One.
You have written about how things that happened in the 70s have, kind of long after consequences, things that we're beginning to see now. The fruits come many years later. And you've also written about how things like Standing Rock, speaking to this indigenous power and people who, resisted the combination of land theft and fossil fuels, that's also had meaningful consequences. So can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think if I have a superpower, it's slowness. And I know it's very different than which means that I see long stretches of time, which lets you see change. One thing I run into a lot with climate is people often conflate impossible with unimaginable. I was asked actually, the last event I did, to tell what the future should look like. And I was like, I have no idea, but that's okay. Nobody in 1973 could have imagined 2023. But everything good in 2023 is because somebody in 1973 or some past moment fought for it. And I like 1973 because you can see the most mainstream narrative is that the civil rights movement, which means the Black civil rights movement, was really in decline at that point, arguably. You could debate that. But native, after Alcatraz and the formation of AIM, et cetera, the native rights movements were really surging. The women's movement was surging. Gay rights were really beginning to gather force. A disability rights movement was happening. And the environmental movement, which was something really different than the earlier conservation movement, was also really beginning to do stuff and even the language for thinking about all these things had to be invented. And I know feminism best in some ways. Words like domestic violence and marital rape weren't concepts or terms people had. So you can see they made mistakes, they stumbled, they didn't quite know what they wanted and what they were doing, but so much good stuff comes of it. So I feel for 2073, it behooves us all to do everything we can towards that better future for human rights, for biodiversity, for 30 by 30 and beyond, and for the climate, knowing that most of us won't, there are probably some young people, maybe. Most of us won't be here in 2073. I don't plan to be, and I think I'd be 112. And, they'll never say never, but, so that you can't see the future, but you can learn the shape of change from the past. And to see it also means seeing indirect consequences and other impacts. A lot of despair, et cetera, comes often from people thinking that if we make demands of a government on Tuesday and they don't fall to their knees and say they were wrong and we were right and give us everything we asked for by Thursday, then we failed. And that's just not how change works, although it's how defeat works.
Right. I think about the Green New Deal, this idea that was really popularized and seen as very kind of far out, extreme in some sense, and then became adopted by leading presidential candidates, and kind of like put it part of their platforms. And that never, we still don't have the Green New Deal, but that has been kind of modified and come into Build Back Better that Biden was trying to get. And then that also failed, but we got the Inflation Reduction Act. So, we're making progress, right?
Yeah, and to assume that if the Green New Deal didn't pass, it failed, which is, again, that kind of short-sightedness that I keep trying to counter, is to fail to see it completely changed the conversation. Part of the genius, even of the name, the Green New Deal, is to say taking care of the natural world is a brilliant jobs program. Mm-hmm. And and you can see there are Green New Deals that have been adopted in cities and regions in the United States and elsewhere. And again, even with IRA, you have to measure the indirect consequences. Like a huge part of Europe and some other countries were like, what, they're going to pump all this money? We need to pump a bunch of money. And so it's having these kind of like knock-on consequences in the same way that Standing Rock didn't stop a pipeline, but had a number of remarkable other consequences, including inspiring AOC, who was just a bartender and waitress nobody had ever heard of, to run for office. And one of the great upset victories of recent history, defeat the third most powerful man in the Democratic House to become the youngest woman in Congress ever and do a hell of a lot of amazing stuff and be maybe one of the great voices of our time.
Yeah, I think so.
So Standing Rock inspired her to do that.
Yeah. So a lot has changed since you entered the climate movement or the environmental movement. How do you evaluate the progress that's been made when we look back? And we've talked about some of these, the recent bills, but when you look back on maybe the last 20, 15, or even 5 years, what we've done, and also considering that as there's been progress, there's been continued acceleration of climate impacts. Last year was the hottest. This is the hottest year on record, and that keeps happening. And
thank you for asking me a slowness question, long-term change. I think if you told people where we were with renewables and how powerful and engaged the climate movement is, and how much the public is engaged compared to where we were 10 years ago, I don't know how much people would believe it. And I think some of the problems we still have are that a lot of people get this vague understanding and don't get updates. The idea that we don't have the solutions, that nobody cares, that the media is not covering it, are all things that were reasonably true to say 15 or 20 years ago. They're completely inaccurate now. And it's also really interesting because there was this period, I think of it as the Al Gore Inconvenient Truth Compact fluorescent Prius era, when renewables, I didn't fully realize myself until I read this wonderful book that's a short history of the human use of coal from the very beginning through the Industrial Revolution to the present. The book came out at the end of the 90s, and it said, burning fossil fuel is bad, but we don't really have an alternative. And I read this about 8 or 10 years ago, and it made me think, oh my God, renewables were not what they are now. We've had an energy revolution, and this energy revolution is too slow for most people to have noticed. Renewables were expensive, they were primitive, they were utterly inadequate to the job, even a little over 10 years ago, let alone at the millennium. So we've had an energy revolution that's incredibly exciting, but only if you can see the arc of change, which is slow and incremental and very wonky. And so everything is different. The early climate movement was polite. It was sort of requesting and kind of trusting governments and corporations to do good things. The idea that we had to fight them, blockade them, call them out, et cetera. I watched the founding of 350.org and watched it go from a kind of nice, polite organization to a much more radical one. The fact that fossil fuel every step of the way is poison, and it's political poison as well, feels like something we're just beginning to recognize, because we grew up in the sort of the age of fossil fuel is regnant and triumphant, and it's been completely normalized, and part of our job is to denormalize it.
Good climate news, good environmental news can be slow-moving, can be highly technical, and as a result, it doesn't necessarily get the same play or coverage or even public understanding as something like a hurricane or a wildfire or things that are much more fast, gripping, kind of destructive, bad news. So I think it can be easy for people to read the news and think that we're in a pretty dire situation. How How do you think about climate defeatists versus climate denialists or deniers?
I feel like there's concentric circles of climate understanding, and then I feel like I'm making a model of Dante's hell, but we'll set that aside. I think his ring sort of descended, mine might ascend. Maybe this is purgatory. But I feel like the denialists are just refusing the information, and I think a lot of it is because what the natural world is constantly telling us is everything is connected to everything else, and we all have responsibility towards the whole, which is a very anti-rugged individualist, anti-free marketeer, libertarian thing. So it's ideologically offensive to conservatives. But they're so far they're so far over there, they kind of don't matter. And but climate defeatists who abound often are also not particularly, they don't deny that climate is real. They often deny that solutions are real, that the movement is real, that coverage is real, that people caring is real. So they have their own amount of denial. There's a kind of depression where you just want to sit in the corner or curl up in fetal position or whatever. But these sort of evangelists of giving up, like the energized ones, I don't fully understand it. But I find that a lot of times very often that their facts are wrong, and that their frameworks about how change works and the nature of power is often wrong too. And then within that, I think there's a lot of people who care, who would like to hope, but who haven't been offered hope. And then what's really interesting, when you get to the organizers, the scientists, the journalists, the people who are really involved, they're scared, but they're not despondent. They know that this is the decisive decade, the future is what we will make it in the present. There are parameters, of course. We can't make it like we never burned those trillions of tons of fossil fuel and put all that carbon dioxide in the upper atmosphere. But we have tremendous choices in this moment. And the difference between the best case scenario and the worst case scenario is profound. I wrote an essay last year called Despair is a Luxury, because for most of us, giving up, at some level we secretly know that we can give up and our lives will still be relatively comfortable and safe.
And it's easier to give up.
Yeah, so what you're really doing is you're giving up on behalf of people. You're saying, let those kids starve, let that ice melt, let those storms destroy the crops of those people in Central America. We who are relatively comfortable, safe, affluent, and therefore powerful, I think have no moral right to give up. And we're giving up, to let other people die first, other people lose first, other species lose first. And I don't think surrendering prematurely is a very interesting way to live your life. And
no, but
I also think the facts don't bear out that we should do that. And I don't think it's ethical. And I think the facts say there's a lot worth fighting for now, and fighting for it is a really good way to live.
So how do we celebrate victories more? Because I think this comes back to the idea that environmental stories, one editor told me once, they ooze, right? They just kind of like incremental things. They go bad slowly, they get better slowly. There's not as much drama. But there have been a lot of environmental or climate victories that are preventing harm.
Yes.
Rather than achieving a new solar plant or something. So how do we celebrate those?
There's both. A lot of victories look like nothing. The forest wasn't cut down. The toxic incinerator wasn't built in the inner city neighborhood, so the kids didn't get asthma. The coal plant, the liquid natural gas export facility wasn't built, etc. So a lot of times, if you're looking for victory, it literally looks like nothing. It's a thing that didn't happen. But a lot has happened and is happening. Bill McKibben pointed out the other day, we're implementing solar energy so fast, it's the equivalent of a large nuclear power plant opening every day. One of the great victories that climate people often hark back to is the Montreal Treaty to stop the ozone depleting gases, which was actually really successful. And then just in the last few years, there was a major milestone in the recovery of the ozone layer because we had this treaty, and treaties sometimes work. But so it's really kind of, a lot of it is on the media, which is part of my job and yours. But all of us are storytellers. And I think one of the things that happens at a lot of climate events is people ask, what can I do? But a lot of what you can do is be informed on climate, including the victories and the possibilities, and bring them up in conversation and be equipped to counter defeatism, despair when it's due to what Thelma and I call bad facts and bad frameworks. Because it's also bad frameworks about how change happens or where power lies, because power also lies in the grassroots. It lies in good ideas. It lies in civil society. It doesn't just lie in elites, which is the story we're often told that to make us give up.
So I want to turn, this is actually a great segue. I'd like to ask you to read something. And this is an excerpt from an essay you wrote following the 2016 presidential election called How to Survive a Disaster. And I'll ask you to read this, and then we'll talk about it a little.
The ideal societies we hear of are mostly far away or long ago, or both, situated in some primordial society before the fall, or a spiritual kingdom in a remote Himalayan fastness. The implication is that we here and now are far from capable of living such ideals. But what if paradise flashed up among us from time to time? At the worst of times, what if we glimpsed it in the jaws of hell? These flashes give us, as the long ago and far away do not, a glimpse of who else we ourselves may be and what else our society could become. The door to this era's potential paradises is in hell.
I love that last line and this idea of finding paradise, of finding solace and comfort and community and togetherness in the worst of times. And you write in that essay, and I think in some other places, about responses to disasters like Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
So how did you come to this idea that these times that can seem like the most dire can actually be really powerful and uplifting and community building?
San Francisco earthquakes taught me that. First, I lived through the '89 earthquake, as I'm sure a lot of you did, whose 34th anniversary was just a few days ago. And I was amazed to find that, like, all the things I'd been fretting about, simmering over, were just completely erased. Like, I was mad at somebody who was behaving badly. I never thought about him again. And I just saw people all over the city came out and directed traffic because there was a complete blackout. People just figured out what needed to be done and did it. In North Beach, for example, the power was out for 3 days, so restaurants, rather than let their food spoil, like set out barbecues and started feeding the neighbors. People tried to rescue the victims of the freeway collapses and things like that. And actually, there was a group, radical group called Seeds of Peace that had fed the great anti-nuclear peace marches, was set up community kitchens and fed the first responders who were working at the freeways. The fire department putting out the fires in the marina was only able to do that because huge numbers of volunteers showed up to help them run those hoses from the ocean to get some water, etc. And then I was commissioned to write an essay in advance of the centennial of the 1906 earthquake. And I found again all these remarkable stories of not what we'd always been told about disaster, movies and a lot of conventional coverage of disaster, including the journalism of the '06 earthquake and the incredibly criminally racist journalism around Hurricane Katrina, is an assumption that human nature is basically corrupt. When authority falls away in the chaos of a disaster, we revert to our primordial nature, particularly poor people, and that nature for men is ravening wolves, plundering, looting, raping, marauding, etc. For women, especially if it's movies with Charlton Heston or Tom Cruise in them, women become helpless idiots who need to be rescued by strong men. It's really, the stories they tell really reinforce the narrative that we need strong authority but what you actually see in disaster, that authority often ceases to exist or becomes obsessed with protecting its own power and private property, which is the least important thing compared to human life in a disaster. Authority often fails hideously. Civil society, the first responders in any disaster are your neighbors. People are resilient, generous, empathic, creative, courageous. But and that's sort of like, rising to the occasion. That's kind of very wholesome. But what I found fascinating is that over and over in stories from 9/11, from Hurricane Katrina, when they weren't stories about the racist violence of the police and the white supremacists, and the Blitz, the bombing of London in the 1906 earthquake. There's a kind of luminous and a joyfulness in people's accounts that told me, we're always told capitalism, consumerism, and in a sense, therapy culture tells us we want material comfort and safety, and we want the pleasures of private life, love, sex, nice things. But I think what we want most deeply is meaning, purpose, belonging, agency, and we lack those. And what's astonishing is that people are that's not the story we hear about who we are and what we need. But people are so deeply fed when they find it in these moments, even when there's been a lot of death, even when their house has burned down, that they're often joyful and bold in a way you don't see otherwise. I sort of thought that I wrote a book this relates to called A Paradise Built in Hell, the extraordinary communities that arise in disasters. The book came out in 2009. I did the research, 2007 and 8, partly because after Hurricane Katrina, I thought we really needed the equipment to understand who we really are in disaster, who misbehaves, who behaves well, etc. Because that's like most of the people who died in that hurricane died in New Orleans, and they died essentially because of racism and the callousness and stupidity of the authorities in charge, from the Bush administration to the governor to the mayor. And I knew that climate change meant that we would have more disasters and more intense disasters, and we needed to understand who we were in the face of disaster. And I wish I was wrong about that. What I didn't understand is that in some ways disasters would become normalized, and the wildfires California had in 2017, 18, 19, 20 were big news stories. Canada just had the biggest news fires in recorded history, and they barely got reported on. The New York Times and a lot of the mainstream media made me crazy because they kept reporting on the smoke, and it's like, hey, have you ever heard that where there's smoke, there's fire? There was almost no coverage of where the smoke was coming from.
Right.
And of course, Canada, Margaret Atwood once said Canada is behind the world's longest one-way mirror. And so what I worry about is that we normalize it, that 1,000 homes burning here, 500 people drowning there, crop destruction, famine here, that there's so much of it will become normalized, which is something I hadn't really anticipated.
But this idea that people really come together and find a truer sense of being in these situations, I think, is one that is very hope-filling when you think about what future, most likely, even if we do accomplish what we're hoping in terms of keeping climate impacts lesser, we're still going to have them. We're going to continue to have them, and we're going to have to find that resilience. What have you changed your mind about, and why?
In order to do what the climate requires of us, there's a lot of very practical, wonky stuff, and very physical stuff. We need to change, we need to electrify everything. We need to change what the world runs on. But I also think that we need to change our imaginations, our values, our relationships. And I feel like what's encouraging about how people respond to disaster is you see this deeper sense of who we are and what we really want, who we could be. And I feel like we have to escape from consumerism. We have to escape from the kind of loneliness and isolation that Silicon Valley and a lot of other structures in our society have helped create. We have to feel that we can have an age of abundance, but abundance will be in confidence in the future and the society we live in, confidence in our institutions and each other, a sense of belonging, a quality of life that will lie in our relationships to other human beings, other species, the natural world. And so I feel like that what disaster shows is that this is who we can be. It kind of shows a way forward, but we need to change the stories we tell about what a good life, a good society, well-being look like as well. I've changed my mind a lot about a lot because I've learned a lot of things. I was not that hopeful in the 90s, and a lot of things, that resurgence of indigenous voice, agency, visibility, etc., changed my thinking. That seeing that seeing it starting in '92, seeing the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet bloc states, made me, a number of other things made me believe that culture can change politics. Politics shapes like the physical, and administrative world we live in, that culture matters in a way I wasn't sure it did, even though I'd committed myself to it as a writer. And I've learned, and a lot of it is just learning. And writing recollections of my non-existence, I finally understood everything I'd written about feminism wasn't about violence, but it was also about voice. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it is just understanding better. And one of the joys of being a writer that I always hope is shared by the reader is understanding something better, seeing something more deeply, finding out something. In my book, Orwell's Roses, I found out nobody who wrote about Orwell was very interested in the fact that he was an absolute passionate gardener who took deep joy in the natural world. And maybe it didn't matter to people writing those books in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but I think for our time it matters. And so my mind changes all the time, and I think we just call it learning. Yeah. And hopefully having a little bit of flexibility. And, I've learned so much. I heard W. Kamau Bell say that he would have talked about race differently had he known then, 10 years ago, what he knows now. I think we've all had an incredible crash course in thinking about race, thinking about trans identities, about gender, and getting past the binary. We've all learned a lot about climate, and so I think we're all, if we're learning, we're changing, and we're changing our minds.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Rebecca Solnit is a writer, historian, and activist. Her most recent anthology is Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us here on Climate One.
Thank you so much.